Thank you for letting me participate in the first hour. I come to you this time from a different time zone. My wife and I moved to Western Massachusetts just a couple of months ago. I have to say, starting at 10 a.m. is more congenial than 7. And we're living in a small town with lots of access to nature. And right across the street from us is a public park with a spacious lawn. And just as you started, they decided to mow the lawn. And so the whole time I was worried that the sound of this huge motorized lawnmower would continue while I'm speaking, and it just stopped. And so I was able to open the window again. So there's some grace going on.
Right.
Out of curiosity, how many of you have read Yogananda's iconic memoir, Autobiography of Yogi?
I'm so sorry, Phil. I accidentally hit the mute button.
Okay.
Can you unmute yourself? I'm so sorry.
Yeah, I don't know what you heard, but
Sorry.
so how many of you read it? I can't see. Okay, and how many of you know about it but haven't read it or been wanting to read it for 40 years? I acquired, I should say, this copy in 1970. It was an important piece of my early days on spiritual path. And I still have it. And I know, because it cost $5 at the time. And I wouldn't have had $5 in 1970 to spend on a hardcover book. So I must have borrowed it and never returned it. And so I always say that I have been writing and speaking about Yogananda the last several years to make up for the karma of ripping off somebody's book 52 years ago. Have any of you read my biography of Yogananda, strategically placed on the shelf behind me? I wrote that book. It came out a couple of years ago. Well, actually, it's more like 3 or 4. It was pre-COVID. Because I had written about all the major swamis and gurus and yoga masters who came to America in an earlier book called American Veda. And in that context, revisited Yogananda's autobiography and looked into his life because he was an important player in the story I was telling. And I became intrigued with his life. And so after that book was out and I thought, what do I want to do next? The idea to do a biography of him came up. And I decided to do it for a couple of reasons. One, that he was maybe the most influential of all the teachers who have come here from India, certainly among the top 2 or 3 in importance and influence, largely because of the popularity of Autobiography of Yogi. And all these great teachings that have influenced all of your lives, whether you realize it consciously or not. that have been seeping into American consciousness for a couple of hundred years about the nature of spirituality and about the nature of what we are, the nature of the inner life and the technologies and methodologies for cultivating a deep spiritual life. All of these teachings that have become part of the American spiritual landscape that were birthed in India in ancient times. He played a major role in propagating them and disseminating them, and his legacy continues even 70 years after his passing. And the other reason I decided to write it was his human story, just the biographical stuff, the arc of his life and the details about his life were fascinating to me because we don't know that much about the lives of renunciates. And, you know, he took renunciate vows as a young man and lived as a monk. Like many of the gurus and swamis and Buddhist masters who came here, they were monastics. And they don't tend to speak very much or write about their earlier lives, but he did. But the real reason, main reason, was when I had the idea to do the biography of him, I reread Autobiography once again and realized how much he'd left out. Less than 10% of the book is about his life after he comes to America in 1920 at age 27. And it was those subsequent 32 years that are most consequential and where he made his mark and accomplished what he did. And there were huge gaps in the story. And it was a delight to go and do the research to fill in those gaps and write a substantive biography that that tells the bigger story of the human story of Yogananda's life with all the details that he chose to leave out and that he couldn't include because he couldn't, you know, I had the benefit of hindsight. And so this course that Mary Grace mentioned that it starts tonight is going through Autobiography of the Yogi week by week for 10 weeks and digging deep. And I get to bring out stuff that's not in the book, a lot of juicy stuff and fun stuff and important stuff. But the reason I wanted to speak about this tonight was it was on my mind because this course is starting up. I should say this morning, not tonight. Is because after I wrote that biography, I found myself speaking about all we can learn that can inform and inspire our own spiritual lives from Yogananda's example and the story of his life. And because I found I never became a disciple of Yogananda's or a student of Self-Realization Fellowship. He was always what in India we call an upaguru, not the Sadguru, your main guru, but one of often many upagurus who are sort of people you learn from, people who inform your spiritual life or your life in general, but who are not with whom you are not in a guru-disciple traditional relationship. There's much to be learned, and I like sharing those lessons from his life. And there are two aspects of his life that I want to chat about and for you to reflect on. The first, and this became, I was very impressed by this when I researched his life, was his ability, which is shared by all the prominent gurus who came here. If they made a mark, if you know their names, it's because they had a big enough following. And in order to do that, they had to have this skill, this quality, what in Sanskrit is called upaya, skillful means. The skill of adapting to new conditions. And at the same time, remain firmly grounded in the integrity of the work they were called to do and the integrity of the teachings that they represented, whatever particular lineage or approach to spirituality a teacher has. He or she has to adapt it to whomever they're speaking to, whoever is the student, at whatever level of development the student is, in whatever culture, whatever language, whatever values, whatever pure era of time, and use whatever means are available. And in the case of people coming here from India, or the East in general, it's a different culture. It's a different world. And in many cases, in Yogananda's case, he came here in 1920. And 1920 America was very different from 1920 India. Different culture, different history, different values, different customs, different way of life. And his challenge was to be true to the mission he was given to bring yogic teachings to America through the particular lineage that he was from, to not compromise on their integrity, and at the same time adapt to this new world that he was in. And Yogananda's life in general spanned an era of massive disruption and change. He was born in 1893. So he was a child and a young man during a period of great change in the world and in India in general. He grew up in an affluent family. But like all Indians, lived under the thumb of a colonial power. They were British subjects and treated as subordinate to the Europeans and the Brits, who were part of the British Raj, down to the point where there were the railroad cars. His father worked for the British railroad system, and so Yogananda, as a young man, got to travel a lot and get free tickets on trains. But they had to sit in the Indian section, the native section, which was inferior to where the Brits got to sit. And he lived through World War I as a young man, with all the deprivation and the crackdowns on the beginnings of the Indian independence movement, There was tremendous suppression. And then in America, he arrived in 1920, stranger in a strange land, having to adapt. He arrived in September of 1920. 2 months later, women got to vote for the first time. That's how things were. The Ku Klux Klan was in ascendancy at that time, and racism was, at its worst, not only for African Americans, but even for people who are now considered white people, but were not then. And now Irish people and Jewish immigrants are considered privileged white people, but in 1920 they were seriously discriminated against. And he arrived in Boston under those conditions, a dark-skinned man with long hair and orange clothing. He learned to adapt fairly quickly. On the ship here, he was advised by well-meaning people to shave his beard. He had a monk's beard, and he shaved it. So all pictures you see of Yogananda after he arrived here, he's clean shaven. But his passport picture has a beard. And you could see that, and I reproduce it in my book. And he learned to adapt. He couldn't change his skin color, and he kept his long hair, but he would tuck it in when he was in public. He would tuck it behind his collar or under a fedora, and would wear Western clothing just to avoid the harassment and that he would have been subject to and was subject to, because he was an Indian representing what people at the time would have called a heathen or primitive religion. And he became a public figure. He wasn't here to just go to school or get a job. He was here to teach. And as he became a public speaker, he became subject to scrutiny. I learned in my research that the British, in America, the British embassies and so forth were keeping an eye on him. They were opening his mail. They were spying because he might have been part of the Gandhi's independence movement. And he was, in a sense, he was outspoken supporter. But there were people, doing things underground at the time. And so he was spied upon and denounced and all kinds of things, and treated as a dark-skinned person to the worst of American racism. And he had to learn to adjust his teachings, his methods, his message to the desires and needs and values of America. His first lecture in America was called The Science of Religion. It was at a kind of interfaith conference in Boston, run by a liberal group. In fact, it was called the Congress of Religious Liberals, run by the Unitarians. And he spoke on the science of religion and yoga's scientific approach to spiritual practice and spiritual experience. And he learned fairly quickly, as he spoke in people's living rooms and stuff, and interest grew. He learned to adapt to American life. He learned that people would come to his public talks if he promised things they were looking for. So he would speak of how use yogic methods can improve your health and greater success and happiness and so forth, not just the larger spiritual message of the tradition, but the real life, immediate fringe benefits that most Americans who even then were into self-improvement were looking for. But he didn't compromise the teachings by making it like the current yoga scene, only about fitness or health and physical practices. It was always in the larger spiritual context that the yogic tradition, what we think of as Hinduism, has to offer. And he learned to advertise, and he learned he had to have an organizational structure in order to grow his following. And he had to comply with legal and financial requirements. And he was a monk. And he had to learn all that stuff, like, any entrepreneur or CEO. And he learned to adapt. So if you go to any organization that teaches in his lineage, even today, if you go on a Sunday morning, you'll come away, like if you in LA go to the Lake Shrine in the Palisades on Sunday morning, or to the SRF Temple in Hollywood, you'll think that Sunday morning resembles a Presbyterian church much more than a Hindu temple. If you've ever been to India or to even the temple in Malibu, it's a very different experience than the congregational American house of worship. And he learned early on that people are accustomed to that, and people interested in his teachings might want to do that on a Sunday morning. And so he started having Sunday morning services. And the teachings were very yogic, adapted to American language and circumstances. They're very Hindu. The chants, the music, the message, the teachings. But the format, people sitting in pews or on chairs, in rows, a sermon, so to speak, musical interludes, prayer, all that is adapted to the Western way of doing things. And he was criticized for that, as if he were compromised. He also learned very quickly to make use of the technologies of his time. So he spoke on radio. Now, of course, he'd have a podcast like I do. and he'd be on, talk shows. And a very critical thing, if you've ever looked into the offerings that organizations in his lineage provide, you'll come across something that SRF calls the lessons. These are, it's a correspondence course, which he started back in the 1920s when he realized he couldn't, as you do in India at that time, reach enough people as he traveled around the country, going from place to place. He traveled a tremendous amount the first 15 years he was here by rail. And you couldn't keep reaching people who are interested in your work, doing it in person only. And so he realized he had to have a publishing wing and a magazine. And that became part of the teachings. And then he created this correspondence course that people would send in a coupon and get a lesson every week or two, where things that he felt could be taught by the written word were included. And he took a lot of criticism for this, because traditionalists would say, no, these things should only be taught one-to-one or in a small group with teacher and disciples. And he said, no, some things that's true. And to this day, some teachings are given only in person and only at a certain time when people are ready, as has always been done in India. But other things he put in these correspondence courses, which are now finally available as downloads instead of only by mail. And so he adapted. So this is my critical point here. Teachings, especially teachings that come from a distant past and a different culture, like the teachings from the East, from the ancient sages, need to be adapted to current circumstances. But it takes great skill and integrity to do that without distorting the teachings and without diminishing them, without corrupting them. He was very successful at doing that, as were many of the teachers who came here subsequently that you're probably familiar with. And we too have to do that. We may not be public teachers, but we're spiritual aspirants. We're spiritual practitioners. And we have to adapt the spiritual teachings we are drawn to the changing circumstances of our lives and of these unique conditions of our circumstances, our personalities, our backgrounds, the moment of spiritual and psychological development we find ourselves in at any particular moment. What do we need? What do we want? What can suit the circumstances of our current life and our lifestyle and families, our work, and so forth. We don't just take the teachings we're drawn to and apply them. We have to use discernment. How much time will we devote? Which teachings will we follow? Which practices will we bring into our lives? Which way of practicing? Which time to practice? All these things are ways we adapt to our own spiritual requirements, drawing from whatever influences we're drawn to. And we have to do it with great discernment, with a great attunement to what we need and what works for us, without distorting or compromising the power and impact that those teachings can offer us. The second takeaway I want to emphasize that you can learn from Yogananda's life, and these are many of what I'm talking about now are things personally that I learned a long time ago along the way, sometimes the hard way, making many mistakes along the way. But I'm re-inspired by investigating Yogananda's life and reading his autobiography yet again because of his class, and doing the research I did about his life. And the other category I want to emphasize is how he remained faithful to his highest priority in life, which was his own spiritual development and his mission to teach as many people as possible. And at the same time, engage what we euphemistically call the real world, the material world, the world of material life and change and ups and downs and craziness. My last book that I published was called Spiritual Practice for Crazy Times, and I believe that's what I spoke about the last time I was with you, shortly after COVID locked everything down. While I was writing it, and times were crazy, I found inspiration in what I learned writing the previous book, which was Yogananda's biography. No one understood better than Yogananda that we are essentially spiritual beings, as it's been said, having a human experience. No one was more consistent in his own practices and in placing highest priority on those spiritual practices and on living a spiritual life and being, without being too distracted or deluded by worldly concerns. He always urged his followers to keep that highest value in the foremost in mind. And he spoke about, in traditional sort of yogic or Hindu terms, about the illusory nature of Maya, of what appears to be the real world. And he compared the stuff of everyday life to the fleeting images on a movie screen, which was new technology at the time. And how it distracts us from seeing the reality that all of it is just light in the movie, coming from the projection booth, and in the world, the light of God, the light of the divine. So he had his priorities straight, and he had renounced worldly concerns and family life when he became a Swami in his 20s, just 2 years before he came to the West. And he took that way of life seriously. And there were times I discovered when writing his book that the responsibilities of life in the world, and don't forget, he taught in America through the Roaring Twenties, through the Great Depression, through World War II, and 7 post-war years. Times of great change, times of great challenge and difficulty. There were times when his organization couldn't pay the bills. He was worried about money for his organization all those years, right up till the end. He had to deal with people trying to destroy his movement, people suing him frivolously, people betraying him, the ups and downs of running an organization, which were hard, which were difficult during the Depression, even for the wisest and the savviest business people, let alone a monk from India, running a volunteer organization. And so he worked really, really hard. And he drove the people around him to do hard work. And he was deeply engaged in the real world, even though he was a monk, because he had these organizational responsibilities and spiritual responsibilities as a representative of an ancient lineage of teachers. And there were times when he was fed up with it all. And I saw it in his letters, and he just wished that he could just go back to India and live like other renunciates, the sadhus, roaming the Ganges or living in a cave or a small ashram somewhere and being completely devoted to a spiritual life. But he had a mission, and he was like Al Pacino in Godfather 3 when he says, "Every time I think I can walk away, they pull me back into it." And that was what he said. He said he would pray to Divine Mother, please release me from this. I don't want to do this anymore. But she's, can't do it. And he never stopped. And through all the difficulties, through all the challenges, through the financial pressure and all that, as you follow his life, you see him rising to the occasion, but always in a spiritual context. It's always in the context of serving God, of serving his guru, serving his lineage, serving humanity, always putting spiritual practice and the spiritual gatherings with his community, the regular satsangs, never compromising on any of that, always spiritualizing the work, always making that highest priority, just as we are called to do in the midst of our challenges, to not forget that. And he dealt with a lot of sorrow, the death of people he loved, the hassles, the lawsuits, the racism. But he also had a lot of happy times. He was a very playful guy. He didn't lose sight of the fact that the real world brings these challenges, but it also has its delights and its joys and its blessings and its gifts, as we're called to remember as well. He loved to travel. He loved to go sightseeing. He would bring back souvenirs for people. He loved all that kind of thing. He loved the landscape of America and loved traveling here. He liked to go to movies. He liked to go to Westerns. And he liked practical jokes. He would play practical jokes on people. And he was a cornball. He would tell seriously corny jokes and laugh. People. I learned a lot from the people who were around him, who wrote about their experiences. Some wrote books, some wrote essays and so forth, or letters. And apparently, he was a prankster and a jokester, and he loved to giggle and laugh. And he took delight in children and all of those kind of things. He was, when you look at it, an individual on the spiritual path. There's a lot of people who put masters like Yogananda on very tall pedestals and make them godlike, make them into perfect beings. And in Yogananda's case and in others, speculate that he was an avatar, meaning he was an enlightened soul from the beginning, here to serve. But if you look at his life carefully and his own descriptions of his experience, he's clearly learning as he goes along, and he's clearly growing as he goes along. And he's clearly deepening in his spiritual experiences as he goes along. He writes about it with great wonder and excitement. He evolved through his life because he was human. And that humanness is, to me, where we can draw the lessons. He got angry. He could be very stern with the people around him. He could be disappointed when they let him down. He fought back when he was challenged. And he stood up against, I should say, injustices in the world. He had to be very careful because he was a British subject until the last few years of his life, when he could finally become legally a naturalized American citizen. But up until Indian independence, which was the first 28 years of his years in America, or 27, he was a British subject. And then after that, our laws did not permit him to become a citizen until exceptions were made in 1949. So he had to be very careful. He could have been deported as a subversive if he wasn't, if the Brits wanted to make an example of him. But he was very outspoken in his support of the Indian independent movement and his admiration for Gandhi. He spoke out against militarism in America. He spoke out against the discriminatory immigration policies. He spoke out against racism and exploitation, especially during the Depression, where people were miserable. And that was risky. And he could easily have said, I'm a monk, I don't get involved in such things. It's all an illusion. Just keep your eye on the prize of enlightenment. But he didn't. He recognized that he's in a human incarnation, and we are living a human life, and we have to be part of it. He was a great example of what we in the West, from the Bible, call being in the world, but not of it. Those of us who follow or learn from the teachings of the East often find value in the teachings on non-attachment. But we often mistake non-attachment for being indifferent and into where we're not attached. But non-attachment doesn't mean being indifferent. It doesn't mean ignoring the conditions of the world and people suffering and our own circumstances. He was a great example of what, in one of the first lessons I ever, hit me very strongly when I first read the Bhagavad Gita, which was the injunction to maintain equanimity in gain and loss, in victory and defeat, in pleasure and pain, which doesn't mean you won't have pain, you won't have defeat, and you won't have loss. It means you do your best to maintain your inner calm and your inner presence, your inner peace in the midst of it all. And watching him in his life lets you believe that you can do that more than you think you can. and that you can do what the Bhagavad Gita calls being established in yoga, in the consciousness of oneness and the eternal nature of what we are, the infinity that we represent, that we embody, and perform action. Establish in yoga, perform action, be in the world. And when you think about the current conditions of the world and the difficulties and challenges we face as a species and as American citizens and as relatively privileged people in the world, like Yogananda, we need to put our spiritual lives first, but then come into the world from that grounding in spirit.
Just to let you know,
take seriously our responsibilities as citizens.
We have about 3 minutes before
I will wind it. I will leave it there and say, maybe there's time for questions. I lost track of time, so pardon my.
We have about 3 minutes, so.
Okay, so.
Bill?
Yeah, thanks. Thank you so much, Phil. Philip, this is great. And I was very curious to know. There's another person who helped popularize Eastern thought especially in America, who was Alan Watts.
Oh, yes.
He former British subject also, and he came through the path of Buddhism and Zen rather than Hinduism. But they both lived in California for a very short period of time. I was just wondering if you knew of any interactions or.
I did not come across it. It was much later. I think Alan Watts actually, first of all, was in the Bay Area,
Yes.
and Yogananda was down in LA. But also, Alan Watts, as I recall from my own research on American Veda, he came to San Francisco around 1950 or 51. Yogananda died in 52. So
Yeah, it was only about a year or so.
I'm sure Alan Watts would have been familiar with Yogananda, or if not then later, because you're right, he was primarily known for his teachings on Zen and Buddhism in general, but he also drew from yoga. He also has fabulous lectures on Vedanta and yoga philosophy and Hinduism. One of his books was on that, and also from Taoism, as you all experience some Tao Te Ching today. So he was a great representative of all the Eastern traditions and a huge figure in that world.
Thank you.
Thank you. We have time for another question, perhaps? Yes. Tom. Tom, go ahead.
There, I found that unmute button. Philip, wow, what an amazing presentation. Thank you very much.
My pleasure.
The spirituality in your studying and teaching of this and the yoga, was there the intertwining of the spirituality and the Christianities and the other religions of the world?
Could you repeat that last sentence? There was
with the
spirituality
elements of this wonderful presentation over the years throughout history, does that intertwine with all the other types of religions when he was working in the world?
Yogananda?
Yeah.
Oh, yes. All the teachers who came here from India had tremendous respect for all religious traditions. And I mean, a core teaching is that every legitimate spiritual tradition, if you take it deep enough, will bring you to that realization of the divine. And so they honored that. And they had a special fondness for Jesus. So all the gurus and all the, everybody speaks of him as, not the one savior of mankind, but as the, great yogi, the great spiritual master from the West. And Yogananda took that to another level entirely. He even held Jesus to be a part of his own yogic tradition, and wrote about it, talked about it, celebrated Christmas and Easter, and drew from New Testament teachings a lot, and integrated them with his interpretation of the Bhagavad Gita and the Upanishads, and showed their commonalities in ways that are quite illuminating and considered blasphemy by some.
Okay, well, thank you so much. Let's acknowledge. What a wonderful presentation. We really appreciate it.
Thank you. I put in the chat box. I don't know if it's too late to enroll in the course I'm teaching on the Autobiography of Yogi, but if you're interested, I put the link in there. It starts tonight, so I don't know.
And I will email that information out to everybody after the meeting this morning.
Can I ask Phil a very quick question?
Okay.
So I know about the two meditation centers, one in Hollywood and one in the beach, but isn't there one in Mount Washington?
Yeah, that's the so-called Mother Center.
Okay.
That's the original place, and that's
open.
He found that place in 1925. So in a few years,
I go there.
I go there.
It is open 10 to 5 every day.
Okay, wonderful.
Yeah, and it's to this day the headquarters of this international organization, soon to be 100 years old. Yeah.
There's also a in Glendale on Chevy Chase,
Yeah,
previously religious
and
science.
in Encinitas,
Center and Encinitas.
the wonderful place in Encinitas, which is where he wrote most of Autobiography of Yogi.
Right.
All right, it's really
Can
time
I
for
ask one
business.
very fast question, Paul? Just one.
Okay.
Philip, I was wondering if you can come back and tell us more about his teachings.
I'd love to.
We can invite him back for sure.
All
Thank
right.
you so much, Phil. Really appreciate the morning.
Yeah.
My pleasure. It's lovely to see you all again.
Thank you, Phil.
All
So
right.
our speaker for next week is Regina Perlmutter, who has presented to us before. She'll be doing past life regression, healing the present. She's really encouraging everyone to think about what issue you might want to address in yourself for the meeting next week, and anyone who wants to participate in the process that she'll offer. It'll be a real personal journey. So it sounds like a wonderful morning. And we need a facilitator for next week. Who would like to facilitate next week? I'm going to send out the meeting format right after our meeting this morning, and you really follow the format. Thomas, was that you raising your hand? Yay. Okay. Meditation next week. Meditation.
Diana put her hand up.
And spiritual reading. Patricia, and closing prayer for next week. Closing prayer or closing reading, closing ritual next week. Really want to encourage people who have perhaps not stepped up to step up. Thomas, that's right, we have two Thomases.
Yes.
Two Dr. Thomases, too.
Two Dr.
Yeah.
Thomas, that's right.
Hey, now with Tom Katz's.
Right. Okay, that's what all I've got, Paul.
All right.
All right.
We have about 5 minutes, Patricia.
I just wanted to tell you all that the Sunshine Committee asked Navid for his address so we could send him a sympathy card. But he said that he would appreciate the messages via email. So I sent an email to him from all of us from Mastery Circle regarding his last loss. So I wanted to tell everybody that.
Okay,
Thank you, Patricia, for always being on top of our Sunshine Committee. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thanks so much. Any other thoughts or comments? Now we have 5 minutes if somebody would like to ask another question. Well, go ahead, Tom, and then Thomas.
Well, when I go to Guatemala this coming week, I was really worried about not sleeping for 6 nights because of the humidity, but it's going to be a bit cooler than it was the last few times. So I'm hoping that I will get to sleep at night, because when I come back, I'm pretty beat up.
Okay. Thomas, you had your hand up.
Yeah, I just wanted to say thank you to Patricia and the group for my Get Well card, which is what I'm holding up here. And they're handmade cards, and they're absolutely gorgeous.
Beautiful.
And I don't know who, is it Lisa that makes these in the group?
Patricia.
It says
would
the
like
card
to
is
keep it.
handmade by El Barak.
Oh, there you go.
So whoever, thank you very much. It's beautiful and I appreciate it. And I love getting something in the mail. So thank you.